Hi, Doug.
Hey, how are you, Christy?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. Thanks so
Good to
much
see you
for
guys.
doing this for us today.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure.
It's so fun. We're all really excited about it. I just wanted to give a small kind of intro to why we wanted to do this. I know you and I have been chatting in the past.
Yeah.
And we were originally a super slow zone when we first opened 17 years ago. And
Okay.
the training is all under Ken Hutchins. And then when we unfranchised, I don't even know when that was, 8 or 9 years ago, we just became our own entity, TruFit. But
Okay.
of course, following Body by Science and you and our trainer Julie, who's up here in the corner, her son actually got really into our training. He's what, 16, Julie?
17 now.
17.
Just turned
And
17.
he picked up the book again, and we didn't have a shoulder press until recently, and so he found one that was local, and we went, and it's a Nautilus one, really nice one. Picked it back up, and we just got re-inspired to do True Body by Science again. And what we started noticing was not that we had gotten away from all the practices of it, but we had gotten away from certain ones that enhance it so much. And so that's where our interest is in talking to you today about these little differences in what we were doing, and then
Okay.
asking for further help and in enhancing a program, even beyond
Sure.
Big Five. Um, so what we noticed, what we had done was added more machines. So
Hmm.
we have about 14 machines. We added smaller muscle groups. Sorry, what'd you say? Um,
There
so
goes Sally coming on board.
yeah, Sally is with a group of trainers at the studio. So you guys might need to mute yourselves there. Um, And so we had added more machines, and we grew our routines to probably be 7 to 8 machines that we were doing in a routine.
Okay.
Sometimes we have 4 trainers that are in the room. And so that can mean slower, progress between the machines. And so when we went back to grassroots and just did the big five that you wrote in Body by Science, we were all really flabbergasted at how much more intense it was, more anaerobic, and just overall feeling. And so we kind
Hmm.
of wanted to dive into that with you today, based on what you've already heard. What do you think was is stalling us?
I don't think anything's necessarily stalling you. So let me predicate the discussion with a few things about the Big Five, Body by Science, philosophy of it. First off, I think it's great that you have other machines that you can kind of plug and play, not simply for the sense of creating variety, but for the purpose of being able to break the big five down into smaller elements as clients progress in their strength. During the first stages of onboarding a client and ramping them up, that big five will carry them through a very steep curve of improvement. But as they become bigger and stronger and consume more of their recovery capacity, especially on a workout by workout basis, um, what can start to happen is that the workout becomes too severe to recover from. So having those other movements to be able to create routines that are a hybrid of big compound movements and smaller, more single joint or isolation type movements is something that you can use to keep the progress going as the client gets stronger. The philosophy behind choosing the big five was to pick large compound movements that would cover multiple muscle groups simultaneously, to have movements that, from a biomechanical and coordination standpoint, were easy to perform so that clients could focus more on high output of effort rather than coordination issues in terms of performing the movement. It was not highly technical. And the third thing was you could rely on the intensity, the gradual recruitment of motor units that produces an ever weakening muscle that closes a window between that muscle's capacity and the selected resistance. Because when you do that, you can rely on the Hahnemann size principle of motor unit recruitment to get into the nooks and crannies of all the smaller muscle groups. So you're relying more on effort, recruitment, and fatigue to get at the small muscle groups rather than having to rely on isolation type movements to target them specifically. But that's not to say that as you progress your client along, that you can't make use of those isolation movements to bring the workout back within the constraints of recovery. So as your client gets more advanced, a big five may wax them so badly that they're going to be below baseline for 2 or 3 days. And at that point, you can revert to 2 or 3 large compound movements and a handful of single joint, smaller movements to compose your workout so that you have a workout that is recoverable to kind of keep progress going, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. That's awesome to know. Why do you think it was that we were feeling so much more fatigued? Is it we were doing more upper bodies back to back to back without recovery in between?
Well, give me some more detail about that. Exactly what were you guys doing with the clients that was different? So you're doing like 7 to 8 movements, and your workout frequency for your clients, your baseline frequency, is that twice a week?
Yeah, twice a week. I really think that a lot of trainers and clients have gotten away from doing all upper body together and all lower body together. So there's a lot of maybe mixing and going from upper to lower. So I'm just wondering if staying all in one area brings the body to more of that inroad, or if that has an overall effect.
I don't know necessarily that that was it, but it's entirely possible that if you perform too many movements and you're going twice a week, it does not take long to outstrip the recovery capacity of your average client.
Okay.
Now, if you're in
The seniors,
go ahead.
especially the seniors.
Yes, and that's true. Now, where a lot of this, there's a lot of HIIT facilities across the country that set as their standard twice a week training that are using, 7 to 12 movements per session as their model. And if you're in a large enough metropolitan area, you are able to select, you have enough of a population to select out from the strata of that population the people that will thrive under that kind of protocol.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have to acknowledge that if you're doing that, that there is a significant strata of the population that you are not servicing that you could be if you allowed for less training frequency and lower volume. So I think as you move more towards the middle of the bell curve of recovery, you're going to find clients that do better with somewhere between 3 to 5 movements done once every 5th to 7th day.
Wow.
And where that gets tricky is when you organizing a business of personal training and constructing a schedule that works is highly dependent on some degree of regularity. So you settle it once a week or twice a week. But if all of a sudden you find that you got a cadre of clients that needs to come Monday, Friday, Wednesday, Monday, Friday, Wednesday, that can scramble up the schedule in the running of the business to a significant degree and make it a little bit more challenging.
Yeah,
So it's
so I think
tricky.
Yeah, and I think what I understood from my training was that that was more of the once a weekers were fast twitch muscle fiber people, and the twice a weekers were predominantly more slow twitch. Now I know we're everything in between, but for the people who,
Yeah, that assumption is correct when you're assuming um, healthy, unstressed people in their 20s and 30s.
okay, wow,
Okay.
really,
So that model for recovery fits. If you're more fast twitch profile, someone that fatigues in, 45 to 60 seconds instead of 60 seconds to 2 minutes,
right,
you're going to be more likely to have a higher component of higher order motor units, which fatigue more quickly and take longer to recover, and therefore might need that kind of recovery schedule. But as we progress into the real world of clients in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, who have mortgages and children in college and all the psychological stressors that come along with, trying to live in a very inflationary economy and blah, 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 blah.
yeah,
All those things take a toll on recovery. And recovery then becomes predicated on things much more than just your fiber type.
okay.
And I think you have to be careful to not underestimate the stressors that people are encountering in their lives and bake that into the cake of assessing what they need for their recovery.
That's really great. And on that topic, we do have quite a few seniors that we are training, and sometimes we have moved towards less high intensity, more frequency.
Mhm.
And that in what you're just saying is not necessarily the
Not necessarily, but this again, and this is what I wanted to stress to you guys too. You may think that to some extent you've drifted into doing things off protocol and not as pure as they should be. But also you've had, a decade and a half, 2 decades of bumping up against the real world and having to make refinements for the real world as it exists. Now, the approach to the older client can depend on what they're willing to and what you're capable of getting out of them in terms of intensity. So there are some older clients that just simply cannot volitionally recruit muscle to the extent that produces a really high level of intensity and deep inroad. And if that's the case, you are going to have to parse it. You're going to have to do a higher frequency to compensate for that.
okay.
So stated differently, if you think of the workout as being this hole below baseline, and then there's recovery, and then there's a gradual super compensation that occurs. Well, if you're digging less below baseline, you super compensate earlier and less, so that the frequency with which you have to introduce the stimulus out of necessity goes up.
Okay.
Now, that means that the magnitude of the adaptive response is not going to be as great, and it's going to decompose more quickly because it was acquired with less initial investment, so to speak, in terms of that intensity. So out of necessity, someone that is not able to bring the level of intensity to justify a lower frequency needs a higher frequency. Now, over time, you can rehearse and build with them the capability to bring more and more frequency. I'm sorry, more and more in intensity. And if you're able to do that, then you can start peeling back the frequency to be less frequent.
Correct.
Um, but that's
But that
kind of
is,
the science of what we do. Under ideal circumstances, you can get them to go there, deliver a high level of intensity. And in an older client, that may be 3 big compound movements, hit it really hard, and then wait 5 to 7 days, and that's more than adequate for their program. But if they can't quite get to that level of intensity, it is acceptable to get out of them what you can and adjust the frequency for the increased rate of recovery under those circumstances.
So better overall health. We watched a YouTube video of yours recently where you talked about this being the basis of all health. I mean, and that's probably a much bigger talk that I would love to hear you have. But overall, why do you believe that it's better to push those seniors to do more high intensity for the 3 compound movements than it is more frequency, or are both somewhat the same? I know you just did explain that a little bit, but is it better for overall health, for bones, for sarcopenia, for other reasons, to push them towards the higher intensity?
You know, it's probably hard to say for certain if one is better than the other.
Yeah.
But I do trend towards trying to get them to be capable of generating the kind of intensity that necessitates that less frequent workout.
Okay.
Because I think the magnitude of all the downstream effects of that powerful stimulus is going to be greater. So you're going to get more aggressive emptying of glucose stores out of the muscle. You're going to get more aggressive glycogenolysis and glucose utilization. You're going to get more aggressive chemical signaling out of the muscle to all the other organs of the body. So more aggressive muscular fatiguing in that protocol is going to generate more of the myokines that signal bone to improve osteoporosis. It's going to have more signaling of myokines that generate BDNF that mitigate against cognitive decline. I think that, for lack of a better way to say it, the ability to generate that kind of intensity signals a youthful phenotype that is beneficial for the body as a whole. So I think that that is, as you progress along, you adjust the frequency to account for the level of intensity that they're able to bring, but I would make it my goal for them to gradually learn to elevate their level of intensity to the extent that it will require a decrease in their frequency, because I think that those more aggressive hits will produce greater benefit for them. But if they're never able to make it to that level, it's still acceptable to adjust frequency for what they're able to give you and live there, because even that is light years beyond what they could generate on their own, or if they were doing nothing. And it is light years beyond what any average personal trainer at the YMCA or a commercial gym is going to be able to produce for them. So the fact that you guys are going after it in this way, even if you have to ratchet the frequency up to account for a lack of intensity, and yeah, it's still so valuable that it borders upon magic, in my opinion.
That's awesome. Yeah, it really does. So let's move on to the healthy 40 to 60 range, no injuries, going high intensity, doing the big 5. Your recommendation was maybe kill back to the once a week or once every 5 to 6 days with them. Should they then be changing that big 5? Should they then be adding more of those other movements?
Yeah, what I would look at doing is if you do the big 5 aggressively, that's a lot of intensity and a lot of metabolic work to recover from. And as they get stronger, the magnitude of what they have to recover from is getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So just kind of keep an eye on their workout record and how they're progressing.
Okay.
And also in conversation with them, how they recovered from their last workout, how they've been feeling in general. Mood is, to me, the canary in the mine shaft for when you're overtraining. If they have been feeling dysphoric, not enjoying things, grumpy, moody, just sort of a dark outlook, then I think that's the earliest marker that you may be hammering the recovery system a little bit much.
Okay.
So I would seek that feedback from the client. And when you start to see their progress plateau and the recovery after a given workout, taking them 2 or 3 days to get back to a baseline where they're just not in this grumpy mood and feeling tired and below baseline, I think that is a marker that you can then subdivide your workout. So you can do a big 3 plus, 2 to 4 peripheral movements. So, you could do a leg press, chest press, pull down, and layer in, a bicep or a tricep, or an abdominal and a lumbar movement, or something of that nature, to bring in some of the other pieces that you have available to you as supplemental movements. So your big 5 could break down into big 3s plus. So you could do leg press, pull down, chest press, plus supplementals in one workout. And then you could do, do you guys have a lumbar extension machine or?
Yeah. Yes.
So you could do a lumbar overhead press compound row, and then a different set of more peripheral exercises. And y'all can sit down to it as a group and just kind of make up a batch of workouts that you can select from to reel back that big 5 to something that is a mixture of your core compound movements and the other movements that you have available to you in your studio.
Cool. So let's talk about speed of movement. So I generally say anything between 8 and 12 seconds in either direction is good. We were taught 10 and 10 through SuperSlow. And in Body by Science, you just say, make sure that the tempo is slow. Well, what happens over time that I notice with clients is the more weight we add, the harder it gets, the faster they go, and it becomes really hard to slow them down. What would you do in that case? What would your suggestions be?
So first thing I would do, one is some of that starting to speed up at heavier loads is out of necessity, because a lot of times to move slowly at a 10-second cadence actually requires some fine motor control. But when you recruit motor units in bigger blocks, you're operating off less pistons, so the fine motor control goes down. So what was once a 10-10 in a leg press, once the weight gets challenging, the best you might be able to get out of a client is 7-7. So the first thing I would say is to define an acceptable range of what slow is. And that's pretty much contingent upon the client and their motor control. I would say for a particular client, going as slowly as they can while still maintaining smooth movement is the correct cadence. And really, in terms of safety issues and continuous loading issues, that speed range could probably be anywhere from 4-4 to 15-15, depending on the client's degree of motor control. And I think anything that falls in that range for a client, as long as it is smooth and continuous and not choppy, is acceptable. And the more important thing than what the absolute cadence is the nature of your turnarounds.
Right.
If you could have 10 seconds up, 10 seconds down, but the turnaround on either end be a little choppy, versus 6 up and 6 down with a perfectly circular, smooth, barely touch, barely start, and perfectly smooth circular upper turnaround. I would take the 6-6 with a good turnarounds over 10-10 with imperfect turnarounds.
I hope Jared call Jared. He's a trainer of mine, and I've fought with him forever about those perfect turnarounds, that they're more important. So I love that you said that. Thank you.
Yeah, the other thing is, what was it? Got what I was going to say about that. A lot of times with some clients, within the 10-10 protocol, as the weight progresses, the other thing that tends to happen is, particularly on the negative, but also on the positive, is that the 10 seconds is not a continuous 10 sec. It's not a continuous movement speed throughout the whole range of motion. And instead, you get a little bit of hurrying during the range of motion that's most difficult, and a little bit of slowing down and sandbagging during the range that is most that is easiest. So what you'll see is the bottom half of the leg press being done in about 3 seconds, and the top half of the leg press being done in about 7.
Yep.
And then on the lowering, the top half of the leg press taking about 7 seconds, and the bottom half taking 3.
Yeah.
So there is some discontinuity of the speed, even if the 10 seconds remains the same. But at a little bit faster cadences, that becomes not possible. So sometimes a 5-5 or 6-6 can be implemented with a client in order to short circuit their ability to hide and sandbag during certain portions of the range of motion. So it's all, that is the art of instructing humans who have these amazing instincts of what you can do to avoid exertional discomfort and deep fatigue. There are 1,000,001 little tricks that they do that, if you're not just really, really focused on the client, they can get it under the radar where you won't notice it.
Yes.
And that's what makes what you guys do a profession, because you can't just be a workout caddy. You know, you just don't like hand clenching. You really got to watch them, because they will sneak all sorts of sneaky shit under the radar. Just instinctually, because we don't like that level of fatigue, and we have all these little tricks of getting away from it.
Well, and I think talking and conversation becomes a little bit of an issue, because these clients of ours, I mean, everybody that's on today, I love dearly. I've been with us forever. And so we find points of conversation and we get to know these people, and it's really easy to get caught up in chatting during a workout. So what would you say to that? What would your advice be to instructors on chatting?
That's an art as well, because some clients, if they're able to chat, usually until very close to the end of the set, they seem to do better, and that's up to the judgment of the client. Now, you can go total hardcore Ken Hutchins on someone, and there's like no conversation at all. And the only words that come from the instructor's mouth are instructional detail, and it's very curt and short.
Yeah.
But it ignores the fact that there are certain clients that, if you are able to conversate with them during the first 60% of a set, then that leaves them enough mental reserve to buckle down and do that last 30 to 40%. And you just got to know who your client is. There are other clients that you really got to pare down your instructional verbiage, because the fact that you're talking to them while they're trying to train basically just irritates the hell out of them. And you got to know who your client is, and that's part of developing that relationship. And before you've developed that relationship, it's part of figuring that out on the fly. So I wouldn't say that unless you perceive that it is getting in the way of a good effort and good intensity, there are certain people where that does seem to help, and you got to decide who's who. If someone is using the conversation as a distraction and not focusing on what they're doing and trying to turn it into social hour instead of an intensely focused effort that it should be, then that's something that, you know, the instructor and client have to hash out and have the hard discussion. But I know in my own studio, there are certain specific clients that every instructor knows that this one likes to talk, and they like to talk up to a certain point, and it's okay because they do better. They perform better if you let them do that. And you just got to know who's who.
Yeah, it's good to hear you say that. So thank you. We implement 5-second holds on certain machines. I don't know if you know that Ken was doing that for a while. And so we just kind of wanted to pick your brain about 5-second holds versus just movement until the last 10-second hold. Do you have a preference or a thought there?
Can you describe for me the
So
movement and
yeah,
the
so sure.
exactly what you're doing?
So compound row and pull down both get 5-second holds on the third one and thereafter
Okay.
at the upper turnaround position.
Okay. I think that is good on any pulling movement, particularly if it has a good fall off cam. I would not simply do it as a 5-second hold. I would actually do it as a squeeze that builds up gradually to a peak and then unsqueezes until the point that you start allowing negative movement to occur again.
Okay.
So it's important to not invoke that until about the third repetition.
Right.
So that you've bled off enough strength so that you're not so strong that you're going to ramp the force too greatly. But what's actually happening is, if the reason there's a fall off cam built into those movements is that as a muscle shortens, its fibers are overlapping more and more till they're close to bottom out. So the force output of the muscle drops pretty precipitously at the point of full flexion. Okay. So if you have that fall off cam, you can actually gradually build up a squeeze. And what you're doing there is you are both using the resistance of the muscle being completely bottomed out and compression of the soft tissues to kind of ramp resistance and get a deeper level of inroad, and also truncate the set so you reach failure a repetition or two sooner than you otherwise would have.
Love it.
That is not invoked on compound pushing movements, because the fall off in force of the fully shortened muscle is compensated for by the fact that the joint is reaching an infinite moment arm to compensate for that. So doing a push or a squeeze at that point does not make sense. But on a compound flexion movement, so that can be a pull down, it can be a compound row, it can be an arm flex, any single joint movement, an arm flexion, a leg extension, a leg curl, a tricep extension. Single joint rotary movements can also invoke that kind of squeeze.
That's awesome.
But on single joint movements, the squeeze works much better on flexion movements than it does on extension movements.
Yeah, and that's when we do them. So
yeah,
great. Yeah, we have 2 clients that are actually on this call today that came to us from another studio that they didn't do the holds. And we have a little bit of different equipment. We have mostly Nautilus. We have a couple SuperSlow machines and a couple MedX machines.
Yeah.
But Mary and Jerry, your thoughts were that the holds were, that they made a tremendous difference, that they really felt like they got a lot stronger with those holds.
Yeah, and I would really instruct to your clients that the holds are not just holding in that position,
Right. I
but
love
actually gradually trying to intensify the contraction in that position.
Right.
Over that 5 seconds and 2.5 seconds, you're going to ramp up to a peak. And then you're going to kind of unsqueeze. And when that peak hits bottom, then the negative commences. That kind of thing.
Awesome. I'm really proud to say that we have 3 people who have had better bone density scores. Not just that they stagnated and stopped from losing, more bone, but that they actually developed. So that was really exciting for us. And I know we have Dr. Small on this call. I'm sure he'll ask you has some questions ready for you, but he is a teacher at one of the local medical schools here in Denver. Dr. Small, you can stop me if I'm getting this wrong. But he was going to take some of those reports to his students because he was pretty excited about that.
Very cool. One thing that I am also really excited about that sort of thing is that it's always been the notion that resistance exercise as it pertains to improving osteoporosis is related to the mechanical load that's transmitted onto the muscle. And I believe that is a minority of the contribution to that adaptation. I think the majority of the improvement in bone mineral density comes as a consequence of myokine signaling from the skeletal muscle. Release of interleukin 15 feeds back to the muscle and the osteoblasts to remodel and to lay down new calcium. And there's actually been studies done where they just isolate out interleukin 15, bathe bone cells in it, and they increase their mineral density. So the exercise protocol is very safe. You don't have to load with a bunch of weight. You don't have to do OsteoStrong, which is a very high force isometric workout. The mechanical load on the bone is not the issue. It's the aggressive muscular recruitment fatigue and the myokine release as a consequence of that produces these improvements. And I think the notion of the loading of the weight being the causative agent of that is from a faulty assumption. I think everyone thinks of the skeletal muscle as a scaffolding or a framework on which everything else of the body is hung. And that's not the case at all. The skeleton is actually embedded within the muscle. It is a biotensegrity system that is suspended within skeletal muscle. So it's not really a weight-bearing, load-bearing thing. It is actually something that is suspended as a tension unit within muscle. So the notion that just, putting it under heavy load is what's doing it is kind of silly. It's really the aggressive recruitment and fatigue of the muscle that makes the difference.
That's really cool. Okay, we have so many questions to ask, but I do want to turn it over to all the participants, in here as well, and see if they have more specific, trainers first for the next 5 minutes. Do you guys have any more specific questions that I haven't asked that you would like to ask? Not so much.
Oh, how about the order of the workout, Doug?
Which
Go
What
ahead.
order do you recommend?
And the big 5, particularly.
Particularly with new clients starting out, I like to do the big 5 with the leg press as the final movement. Because if you're completely fresh and you really give it all on leg press, the metabolic wallop from that has a degradatory effect on everything else that is occurring subsequent to it. So I like to do the big 5 sort of in order of upper body movements. And their particular order doesn't matter a lot to me. It can be compound row chest press, pull down overhead press. It can be pull down overhead press, compound row chest press. Doesn't really matter, but I would tack the leg press on the end because it involves such large muscle groups and has such a profound metabolic effect that I think it's better as a finisher than a starting movement. And the other reason for that is the pump that is generated in the musculature of the upper body serves to dampen cephalad venous blood flow toward the head that in leg press could result in an exercise-induced headache. So it does mitigate against the production of EIH somewhat to have the leg press at the end rather than the beginning.
Mm.
Dr. McGuff, I'm going to try to not go total fangirl on you here, as I am a huge fan of yours, but I wanted to ask for people that are, lift really heavy. What are some things you look at to be careful with? I know we look for the form and everything in that, but, I've always had friends tell me like, I do the 5 days a week, and I'm like, come in here with me for one day. I promise you'll limp out of there like Bambi. What are some things you look for maybe in clients that do lift heavier and are kind of hitting it pretty hard to, watch out for or progress with?
So the first thing is those clients can tend to be the ones that are extrinsically focused. They like to see the entire stack move, and they will invoke whatever body English possible to make the big weights go up and down. So they're more extrinsically focused. So the first thing I would work on with them is peeling their weight back maybe 15 or 20% and really getting their form perfect. And to have the real discussion with them that what we're trying to accomplish here is not to do something to the weight with our muscles, but to use the weight to do something to our muscles. Once you have that handled, and you just have to make certain that they stay intrinsically focused. And as long as they're doing that, they're going to be less likely to invoke things that could be injurious. So heaving and jerking or doing anything to keep the weight going or to try to get the next rep when they really should just fail under proper form are the things to mitigate against. Also, as the weights get heavier, the inclination to Valsalva, to grip, to grimace, and to use body English to keep things going are all possibilities in these people. But if they're using big heavy weights, the form's perfect and their behavior is correctly oriented towards the real objective of the exercise rather than the assumed objective to make impressive looking amount of weight go up and down, I think you're going to be fine. If they're strong enough to use that heavy a weight under correct form, they're going to be very unlikely to do anything to harm themselves.
In going with that, you had a talk recently about, recruiting other muscles affects the recovery. Can you kind of expand a little bit on that? Like you said, doing maybe the weights heavier and you're, straining, moving it, it can affect the recovery because you're not just recovering that muscle.
Yeah. So, Al Coleman talks a lot about this, in motor learning theory, there's a primary postural task and there's the secondary postural task. And the primary postural task is just to get in position to do the movement. So in a chest press, your back's against the back pad, your shoulders aren't scrunched. And in fact, they're the opposite of scrunched, and you're this, and your head's in a neutral position. And you're going through the motion with the primary postural goal in mind. And the secondary movement is what you're trying to achieve in a particular form. And you want to continue to do that until you fail without a change in form. But once you start squirming, moving, bucking your head, charging your head forward, doing all these behavioral discrepancies results in an output of energy that is very significant, but does not contribute to loading and fatiguing the musculature. So you are throwing off all this excess energy that is not being directed at the stimulus. So you are creating a lot more to recover from than is necessary for what you're getting in terms of the targeted musculature. So this is sort of a minor version of if your client was to do CrossFit. Now, you can do untargeted muscular work that is almost pure outrunning. So, you can beat a tractor tire with a sledgehammer, and you're going to do a lot of work, but there's going to be there's going to be way more expended energy to recover from, way more force on the joints and the connective tissue than there is inroading and fatigue of the musculature that's going to result in any sort of improvement. So you want to operate within the constraints of, we're trying to create a stimulus here, not put on a show. And if there's all sorts of extraneous movement trying to put on that show, then that's a lot of extra work that's done that is not directed towards creating a stimulus. That has to be recovered from, and that has a toll both on recovery and wear and tear that doesn't need to be there.
Does this mean also no grimacing, shouting, yelling as well?
So there is the letter of the law, and that's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law is, if you really, really go there, if you're going to grind out that last rep, a lot of time you're going to grimace, you're going to scream, you're going to grunt, something's going to happen. You're not going to go to super slow hell if that happens. And that's part of really having to go there, because that level of intensity is a huge adrenergic outflow. You're just dumping adrenaline to make that happen. And a lot of times that results in those sort of discrepancies. Over time, you can learn to control that and limit that. And that should be the, that is the letter of the law. But I think the letter of the law is that castle on the hill that we aim for. But I think we need to be more than happy to operate within the spirit of the law, which says, try to minimize that as much as you can. But if it squeaks out at the end, I wouldn't have a litter of kittens over it, because it's not that big a deal.
I love that. All right, I'll turn it over to clients. Do you guys have any questions? Love it, Kurt. Go.
So this is Jim Small.
Okay.
Doug, I'm the one that teaches at the medical school here.
Yes, sir.
And it's a DO school. So first,
Okay.
if you have a dream research project, pass it on to me. If there's something you want to do that other people are not doing, and I'll see if I can recruit some young, strong DO students to do something. But
if you have any young, fat DO students that are going on GLP-1 and GLP-1,
I'm sure
I would like to see body composition changes on GLP-1 agonists with and without resistance exercise.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea. I will bring that up to the research group. So I've been doing this for about 12 years. And when I finally do the leg press, I am frickin' toast at the end of that workout. And I have just operationally figured out I can't do that more than once a week. I can't do that workout more than once a week. And furthermore, my wife, who is very observant, like whose wife isn't, says, hey, I think it's time for a week off. And Christy's gonna laugh here, but I do 3 or 4 weeks in a row, and then I take a week off. And when I come back after the week off, I am 95% of the time, I come back with longer times under load.
Yes.
But I'm curious about the possibility of more of a split workout,
Mhm.
as you're discussing here. Because I'll tell you, doing everything from the low back to the row, to the pull down, to the chest press, to the leg press, it's a freaking killer now.
Yes.
So,
So you're in that realm where you've gotten strong enough on the big five basic type movements where it's hard to recover within that time frame.
yeah,
And I think it's perfectly acceptable to subdivide the workout if you want to try to do that. And, you can divide it in half with an upper or lower body thing. You can divide it into 1/3. It can be a push-pull legs. It can be chest and back, shoulders, arms, legs, and abs, something of that nature. Or what you could do is in one workout, do the lumbar machine only. And in the next workout, do the leg press only.
mhm.
So that you're encountering those really big demanding movements for large muscle groups only every 14th day. But I think it's certainly reasonable to experiment with those sort of things. I think the very important key for your workout program is that it, in the balance of the 7 days per week, that you feel better and above baseline more days than you feel below by at least 2 to 1. So if it's taking you 2 to 3 days to feel unknackered from that workout, it's time to make some sort of adjustment.
Okay.
If you're just barely recovered by the time your 7 days is up, then, you spent too many days below baseline. And I think that we really underestimate how, golly, I'm not sure the right way to phrase this, but I think we don't realize how slow the time course for adaptation and recovery is when you train really hard. And sometimes just spacing things out and modulating volume and frequency can feel almost miraculous once you get it figured out.
I'll have to work on it. The last thing, just real quick, I started upping my protein because I listened to too many podcasts.
Yeah.
And I started upping my protein over 100 grams a day. And all of a sudden my time started going up again.
Yeah.
Even after I had thought I had plateaued, I'm 70. I thought I had plateaued, and all of a sudden I started making gains again. So I'm not sure if it was the protein, the fact that I'm not in active practice anymore, and that it's just a lot easier to teach than it is to do pathology in a hospital.
Yeah.
So there's too many variables, but the
I think,
protein thing, I
probably a
think is
combination of the
important.
above. But I do think that, particularly as we age, I'm 62 now, so I'm right on your heels. And I'm finding that, making sure that your protein intake is adequate is necessary. In older individuals, if you look at the research, just kind of Google anabolic resistance in senior athletes, you'll find that there is anabolic resistance to even increased protein, so that you have to increase it disproportionately, both because absorption is less and utilization is less efficient. But the interesting thing is that if you apply an intense training stimulus that accounts for recovery, the anabolic resistance goes away. So that's the neat thing, but I definitely think that it's important to be getting in the diet about 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight of protein in a 24-hour period, to make certain that you have enough substrate available to make the adaptation with. Now, understand that in the training stimulus, a significant amount of the protein that's utilized for the adaptation is actually recycled out of the skeletal muscle. So when you're working really hard, the misfolded proteins and the damaged proteins get destroyed in that process, and the amino acids get released in the bloodstream, get retaken up and reassembled into properly folded proteins and put back into the organs in general and the skeletal muscle in particular. So some component of your daily protein requirement in the context of training is actually provided by turnover within the skeletal muscles. So that's kind of cool.
That is really cool. I've not heard that.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I have a couple of questions that
Yep.
relate to plateauing. First is, I got back on the Big Five and started keeping track of my results personally so I can look at them, which is for me a big positive feedback because I can say, oh, I've gained. Well, some of, like, for the last while, I've been, you know, within a few seconds and not going in pounds, going up in weight. How do you define plateau? And then the other part is, once you hit plateau, once you hit that definition, what are some options you use to get past that?
Number one, I think plateaus as it pertains to your workout record don't really exist. They just get lost and embedded within a measurement tool that does not thin slice enough.
Okay.
So if you think about a MedX chest press or a MedX leg press, even with the 2-pound weight increments, you're talking about a piece of equipment that still has a very significant sticking point at certain parts of the range of motion. And that sticking point is big. So you may be having, so your improvement's always going to be, if you look at the screen, steep, and then it becomes asymptotic. And when you get on the asymptotic part of that curve, on paper, it's going to be impossible to detect the small incremental improvements that you're making over time, because the weight and time under load is just too coarse a measure of the micro progress that is being made along the way. At that juncture, what I tell people to do is to take your focus off the record, because then what you will start to do is you will try to force progress on paper. And if you are successful in producing progress on paper that's visible, it is by virtue of form discrepancies that degrade the stimulus quality that you're looking for. At the point that everything starts to become asymptotic is when I suggest that you stop being an accountant and start being an artist. And what I mean by that is, don't worry about the record, what weight's on the left side of the slash and what time under load's under the right side of the slash. Instead, at that point, I want you to take your focus and become very qualitative. I want you to think only about the repetition that you're doing. That one repetition, I want you to think every time, don't think about the repetition prior, don't think about the repetition that's coming up next, and don't think about the goal number of repetitions or time under load that you're shooting for. Blind yourself to it, focused only on the repetition that you're doing, and think only, how can I make this repetition as perfect as possible? And how can I make every piece of the range of motion of this repetition as difficult as possible? And that may result in an output that looks worse on paper, but I promise you that in terms of what your body's receiving and the adaptation that will occur, it's very superior. So you've reached a point in your training where you got to stop becoming an accountant and become an artist instead.
Thank you very much.
I have a
Dr.
question.
McGuff, I've got a quick question for you on that note. I actually, just as a side note, trained with you about 12 years ago at your facility.
Oh,
It's hard to
cool.
believe it's been that long ago.
Shit, tell me.
As it kind of relates to what I'll call kind of the meta level analysis, in terms of what you experience as a trainee, I've been doing this long enough now where I'm kind of fortunately past the fight or flight response. But I find myself sometimes in my own mind over analyzing what I'm doing in the moment in terms of kind of like monitoring form, performance, feedback loops, and whatnot. And I find that it sometimes degrades perhaps what I could be doing otherwise. So how do you kind of get out of your head and just leave everything on the field when you're a trainee?
I Yeah, that's something that happens, particularly in longtime super slow nerd practitioners like me and you. And I find what happens in that is, in order to overcome the paralysis by analysis, instead, I think you need to focus on aggression. And it's hard to articulate it, but rather than thinking about all those little nitpicky nuances, Ken Hutchins type form criticisms, instead, pick a spot on the wall and just try to burn a hole through the wall with your vision and focus on making the movement as calm and as aggressive as possible. So instead of analyzing every little bit and thinking about trying to make it more and more perfect, focus instead on a calm aggression and let that other stuff fall to the backside, because that being overexpressed can also sort of degrade the quality of the workout.
Thank you.
Doug, I have a question
I have
about
one.
unilateral failure. I have Parkinson's disease, and I find that occasionally one side, my left side, will fail before my right side. Is there anything I should do about that?
No, I would not worry about that. I think most of, and correct me if I'm wrong, probably most of the equipment in there has fused movement arms, and the failure will kind of get distributed equally across the body, particularly in Parkinson's disease. The motor unit recruitment is a little bit choppier, and recruits motor units in larger batches. So it's like a car firing on 4 pistons instead of 8, and sometimes something can fail before the other. But I would just focus on trying to push as far as you can, and whichever fails first becomes the rate limiting factor. But I think you'll find over time, if you do that, things kind of self-correct. And I can say that until there becomes, some curative component for Parkinson's, which I don't think is too far off, I don't think there's anything better for it than resistance exercise. If the motor units are strong, what you're able to recruit is going to be more effective. And I do think that the performance of resistance exercise refines the neuromotor recruitment patterns to make you more effective. I mean, I recall we had a Parkinson's patient that we could not get through the front door of the facility because we couldn't get them over the 1-inch threshold in the door because of how bad the shuffling gait was. But within 12 weeks, they were massively more functional. We're not using a rollator or a 4-prong crane and could walk right over that threshold, no problem. So I don't think there's anything better you could be doing. And those sort of little quirks and limitations will rear their head from time to time. But I think just let whatever fails first define what failure is, and then just keep going.
And I have a question if you can hear me. Traditionally in the super slow with Ken and in your work, the lore has been that alternate athletic activity such as running, walking, treadmill stuff between workouts is actually detrimental. Do you hold that still?
No.
Okay.
I think that was kind of part of the he was building a movement, and a movement doesn't only require a God, it requires a devil, and the devil was aerobics. And I think that that was kind of baked into the cake. And to a good degree, it's true. But here's what I will say. I don't think that it's detrimental. And I don't think most of those activities reach a threshold of intensity high enough to really interfere with what we're doing. And to some extent, I think some of those lower intensity activities may actually augment recovery to some degree. But I think the more important, what I would say though, is I don't think that those kind of exercise or sporting notions need to be incorporated deliberately by design. Because what I found was a failure of the Ken Hutchins philosophy as I tried to apply it in my own studio. So in the early days when I first opened, we were hardcore super slow, and we had clients that were like running that we like, don't run, don't do it. We really had them, our thought was you come here and train and you go in a suspended animation chamber until you come back.
Yeah.
Don't do anything else. Well, that failed miserably, because once we got people within a certain degree of muscular condition, they just went apeshit. They started running 10Ks, they started taking up sports, they were playing tennis, they were mountain biking, they were doing everything. And what I came to realize is, and we could see it on their record, once they got about 35 or 40% stronger across the board, their activity just blew up. I think once muscle reaches a certain level of capability, you activate what I call the active genotype. And then they spontaneously and organically become active. And I think that that is more than adequate to address those other components of fitness or activity or what have you. I don't think it has to be programmed in this Peter Attia zone 2, an hour a day, 5 days a week kind of scenario. I think if you get someone strong enough, they spontaneously become active to an ideal level. And if you just let that express itself organically, it'll take care of itself.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yep.
Doug, do you have an opinion on blood flow restriction training, on whether or not that's good in this to combine with this type of exercise?
Yeah, the literature strongly supports blood flow restriction training as being efficacious. I don't know how redundant it would be with the slow cadence, high intensity training that you're doing, because the continuous muscular tension actually produces a good degree of venous trapping within the skeletal muscle that is sort of like baked into the cake blood flow restriction that occurs with slow cadence training. So I've not seen any studies that looked at slow cadence training with and without blood flow restriction, doctor. So if you want to add that to your research list, that's something to investigate. But blood flow restriction training is useful, particularly for people that have injuries where they can't use as big a load as normal, but you want to get recruitment and fatigue to a meaningful level. That's where it becomes very useful. What I think, though, is that is under normal training scenarios at, the typical cadence that you see at the bro gym. I think that slow cadence training probably has a component of venous blood flow restriction baked into the cake, and that it's already there, and that's part of why it works so well.
I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. McGuff. So I know that we're at time, but in 30 seconds or less, can you tell everybody why you think this is the best workout ever and everybody in the world should be doing it?
Because it has something very unique to it. In every other form of exercise, if you want to raise the intensity, you have to raise the forces involved and therefore the risk. This protocol, what we are doing with cadence controlled, continuous loading, deep fatiguing, resistance exercise, is very unique because it produces an increase in intensity and all the benefits that it brings that we have talked about earlier. But when you do that, you are recruiting more and more of your skeletal muscle and fatiguing it. So basically our protocol involves using a greater and greater percentage of our ever weakening musculature until we reach failure. It is the only form of exercise that whereby you raise the intensity, you lower the forces involved and increase the safety. Literally at the end of the set where it feels most intense, you are least likely to hurt yourself because you're literally too weak to generate enough force to do so. And that is such a unique proposition that it's almost miraculous. And the intensity is high enough to generate all of the downstream signaling to all the other tissues of the body. And that's what makes what we do so unique. We make it harder and safer simultaneously.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was so
Awesome.
awesome. We love
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
We'll
you.
probably
Thank
do,
you.
another one next year and talk about all the other things that are out there.
All right, cool. Sounds good. Listen, you guys are, I just want to give you props because, you know, it's hard to train clients. It is a profession. What you're doing is a professional thing. To my way of thinking, it is the most important work that you can do with another individual. I know at times it can be fatiguing and exhausting, but please keep it up. Keep doing what you're doing because what you do matters.
Thank you so much. I
Yeah,
really
you bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great talking to you guys.
Bye.
Bye,
All right.
guys.
Bye, everyone.